Well, hello and welcome to As Time Goes By. You know, over the last several weeks, off and on, we've been looking back at the history of Lawrence, and I tell you, I have just fallen in love with this whole concept of taking piece by piece the city of Lawrence and taking a look at it. We've had a great time. Steve Jansen is back with us today to talk about kind of what we consider the last segment in this particular series from about the 70s on. So stay with us for As Time Goes By coming up. Well, we've had a good time over the last several weeks, as I say, off and on, looking back at the history of Lawrence. And Steve Jansen is here from Watkins Community Museum. And Steve, I don't know, I kind of wonder if anyone knows as much about Lawrence as you do.
Well,
maybe
I
that
think
attachment to the museum.
I always say that the people that live here that have lived here all their lives, they know this town better than I do. It's just that I've learned it perhaps in an unusual way, because I know the early part, the middle, as well as what we might say is now within the memory of man. So it's just that I think I bring more to the table in more ways than one, and than most people that live in Lawrence. But I still think there's parts of a town that you only know by living in it.
By being a part of it yourself.
I'm still a newcomer in a lot of ways.
I realize that, and so as I am, but
Right.
This has been so informative and so helpful to understand the history of Lawrence. And now we started out in about 1854
Right.
with you might say the pioneer days, and now we're about to wrap it up. I'm saddened by this, Steve.
Well, I'm talking to your producer, you know, and we think there's infinite possibilities. Right.
When we left off last time in segment 5,
Right.
Mary was standing by the, no, that's another, the burning of the Kansas Union, sort of where we took our turn. Where are we now?
Well, when the Kansas Union burned, that was sort of the crisis, the crux of the crisis of the unrest, both that had been felt in the city of Lawrence as well as the University of Kansas. And that's the beginning of when we see the physical changes begin to occur to the university campus.
That would be the late 60s, right? That would
well,
be,
71 is the burning of the Union.
So we're into the 70s.
Right, we're into the 70s, and so, if you will, the 60s lap into the early 70s. But by the time I came here in 1974, things were definitely quieted down, and the Union had been rebuilt and reopened, but they began to make physical changes. All of those Gaslight and White House, all those buildings that were close by the Union where students hung out, are bought up and become parking lots, and eventually Adams Alumni Center. And we begin to see a moving away, if you will, of the opportunity for people to gather in close proximity to the university. And that's one of the lessons that's kind of learned, I think, from the late 60s and early 70s.
It sort of parallel, I mean, absolutely parallel the ending of the war, the Vietnam War, didn't it?
Well, in a sense, that was the fuel that kept the fire going. So long as young men were being directly impacted by the crisis in Southeast Asia, that kept adding fuel to the fire.
So this dispersion, I guess you could say, of the population within Lawrence sort of gave it a little different look, didn't it?
Yeah, and you begin to find, you know, this is the classic emergence of the town square pattern of 6th Street, 23rd Street, Iowa, and Massachusetts Street. So we form a town square. This is the complete irony of, in 1880, the fact that they thought the university was so far out of town and it should be put in the middle of town. Well, now the Lawrence of the 1980s and 1990s, the university is in the middle of town. And you see the development of 6th Street, which had only one commercial establishment in 1955.
No, wait a minute, 1955?
Right. And that's when they complete 6th and Iowa, the bridge at 6th and Iowa, where they're building the motels now. That bridge is an enormous amount of dirt and concrete. Before, it used to go in and out of town on 7th Street. So you have to have, in Iowa Street, when you go down Iowa Street between Harvard Road and 15th Street, you go over an enormous bridge. But the trees have grown up so much, you don't even realize you're on a bridge.
You just go through, you think you're on the road.
Yeah, right.
And I would suspect then, if this is the case, and it certainly is, that there were a lot of displaced farms even in this
definitely.
growth, wasn't there?
The Chamonix Dairy Farm, which is it's the glass blowing barn now off of 15th Street, and there's one little stone house there. They had 6 dairy barns, and when they put in the south half of the 15th Street Boulevard, they took out the 6 barns, and the family was moved off the land in 1970. And their story, I was talking to Arden Booth, who and Hank and Arden Booth, local radio people, have been running cattle one way or another in Lawrence. And in the 50s, it was where Dale Willie is at 27th Street. Then it moved over to Castled, where Castled on the curve is. Then it moved out to what would be Clinton Parkway, and now the Wakarusa Drive. And now they're out by Pleasant Grove, way south of town. So literally 4 times in 30 years, they've had to move their cattle and the raising of cattle and the grazing of cattle as Lawrence has continued to push them further south and west.
Almost out of Douglas County.
Well, at least out of the valley.
You would almost surmise that a lot of this change came about because of the building of the interstate, but actually the interstate had been there since the 50s.
Right, and you can argue that one of the things that happens in Lawrence is the interstate almost sort of doesn't have the full impact of a freeway. You know, what's really happened, and I noticed just recently how much the pace of traffic is picking up because of a 4-lane K10. So K10, in a sense, so long as it's the turnpike, you've only got 2 ingresses and egresses, 2 entrances and 2 exits. And you don't really have, you know, even in North Lawrence until the last 10 years, much development of restaurants and shopping centers. In West Lawrence was almost outside of town, so it took 20 years for the town to kind of grow out to the turnpike, because in a sense Lawrence was tending to grow south and west. That's why the K10 footprint is much more larger and dynamic, because that's the way the town is growing.
To me, as a person who first saw Lawrence about 10 years ago,
Right.
it seemed to me that there were 2 main streets, just as an observer coming
Right.
in. Now that's outside of downtown. I'm saying
Right.
traversed roads.
Right.
One was K10, is
23rd Street.
23rd Street,
Right.
and the other was 9th. No, I'm sorry, Iowa.
Iowa, right,
Iowa.
right.
Those 2 streets, and of course they converged down
Right.
there, seem to me to be where the thrust of the economy, the thrust of merchandising and so on were. Is that changing, or has it changed?
Well, I think now you're getting a kind of Wakarusa Drive, and you're getting sort of farther out. You know, in a sense, Iowa in 23rd Street, or K10, in the 1950s, I can show you headlines that say bypasses. I mean, they literally were supposed to be bypasses. So I always say to people, I hope we have better luck with our next round of bypasses, because one little curb cut here, one little entrance there, and pretty soon you've got a major arterial with lots of ingress and egress. And so in a sense, they were intended to funnel traffic around the town, but now they've become commercial streets where many of our strip shopping centers have developed.
Yeah, because when that happens, then you have to put in a traffic light.
Right.
Some places, because people begin to hit that corner regularly, and so that slows down the traffic in some ways,
Right.
at least in that one direction. Yeah.
And in the last 10 years or so, especially because of one-time city manager Buford Watson, you put in that turning lane. The big change is that it used to be a 2-lane road, then it becomes a 4-lane road, and now it's a 5-lane road, because you've got down the middle to help people make turns, that 5th turning
No,
lane.
that's where you have your head-on collisions. Is that what you're talking about? The middle
Hopefully
lane?
not.
The middle,
Right, yeah,
the
that,
head-on collision
right.
lane.
But in a sense, the traffic managers, and we're fighting this right now with 23rd in Massachusetts,
They'll
and
love me
there's
for
letters
that.
to the editors in today's paper about, you know, because now classic highway engineering wants a turn lane. For wherever there's a significant amount of traffic, we want to give people a way to do that, and also allow people who want to keep proceeding whatever direction to make their decision to go, and not have them back up behind the person who wants to turn.
And of course, Lawrence does have a sufficient number of those, at least it seems to me right now.
Right,
Those turn lanes.
but what's happened is, if you look at 23rd Street, I was just discussing this with my wife Kathy when we were driving down 23rd Street on Saturday night. Whenever they replan 23rd Street, a new business comes in. They force them to put in green space, plant trees, put up bushes. So 23rd Street of the late 60s and early 70s was literally a suburban sprawl with very little green space and very little trees. The 23rd Street we see now has much more plantings, much more green space. In Iowa, because of the University of Kansas campus being along much of it, has always had a more greener look. And as you look at Clinton Parkway expanding beyond Iowa, that's always had a larger, greener expanse.
Steve, don't you think in time, I mean, as experience has given them an opportunity, city planners and so forth have learned some things, don't you think, about
Right.
traffic? I mean, after all, traffic as we know it today is, what, 60 years old at best. with the kind of numbers we're talking about and the speed with which people travel and so forth. It seems to me that there has come about a science of planning, so that now they're able to say, look, if we want this place to both take care of the heavy traffic and look good and have some sort of aesthetic value, we're going to be able to, we're going to have to plan the greenery, get the trees, all of these things. Don't you see that happening?
Oh, definitely. And at one time on Iowa Street and 23rd, you saw concrete dividers in the middle of the road to funnel traffic. Well, now they found that that creates traffic, that it jams people up, that somebody misses that, and now they put markings on the street, but they keep the street uniform.
Yeah.
You know, so I mean, there's adaptations as they can see that certain ideas that they thought would work just don't test the test of time. So I mean, I think too, though, the thing that's happening now is so many university students bring cars. There was a time, it's clear to me, when students did not expect to have an automobile immediately available to them, and they could travel by bus or train or carpool with other people. So now more people need cars to accomplish their daily objectives. And so that not only is the population growing, but our population is becoming even more connected to the automobile.
Not sure, I was going to say, not sure much can be done about it, but there's so many single drivers, that is, individuals driving with no other passengers in their cars these days, because they do have those appointments, and those appointments are always across town. You know, we don't hesitate anymore to say, well, you know, I'll drive across town or across the county or whatever. Well,
and the big challenge we have, I think, in the years to come, and this is obviously beyond my expertise, but what is going to be the role of public transportation? You know, in 1920, 80% of Lawrence lived within 2 blocks of a streetcar. We're a long ways away from that. We have a tendency to think that because we live now and they live then, that we have more choices. I would argue that in some ways, our choices seem to be more limited when it comes to transportation. However wonderful the car is, it is essentially the only choice that many of us have available to us.
We go farther faster.
Right.
But like you say, we can't say, well, I'll catch a train
or catch a streetcar or take a trolley. And that's a major capital investment, and we may not be able to want to pay the freight to make that capital investment. But it changes the quality of our community as we have, you know, 6 lanes with lots of traffic.
I'm a little depressed, Steve. I just realized I remember trolleys. We'll be back with more with Steve Jansen right after this. Don't go away. Welcome back. Steve says I'm getting a little too comfortable with this history stuff. I'm identifying too much with history rather than the present. That's almost tragic. Communities, of course, are buildings and roadways and trees and all that, but buildings really are people. And knowing that, I mean, that sounds a little trite to say, or cliched, but what about the people of Lawrence? How have they changed? Or
well, we used to have maybe 5 to 8 core neighborhoods. Now we have over 25. And I think that surprises people.
How do you identify a core neighborhood?
They form a neighborhood association. When they
just by that?
Well, that's one way to say you've got like interests and you want to work together for cooperative purposes. And now we have over 25 neighborhood associations.
I'm sorry. Are there sometimes natural boundaries that designate?
Well, in this town, you've got the river, you know, and you've also got the major arterial streets of Massachusetts Street or Haskell. And then you have maybe the 9th Street versus 6th Street in Old West Lawrence, Kentucky versus Maine in Old West, Oriad, the neighborhood around the university. So you've got, but as the suburbs have developed, you've had more of what I call classic subdivisions. So the neighborhood that's formed grows out of the planner's subdivision that got it started.
Is Lawrence like so many communities where people, particularly as it has grown, and I suppose with the university climate also, neighbors have lost touch with neighbors? Has that happened too?
Well, this is a much more transition area. I mean, many people come to our community and expect to only stay here 4 years, to go to the University of Kansas, or as their first professional teaching position, or they're brought here to work in an industry and they can expect to move someplace else with another plant. And so you have more transitory character. And so the core of the Lawrence, you know, if we're 72 or 73,000 now, the question I've always said is, how many are really committed to Lawrence? And that's someplace between maybe 35 to 50,000. So in a sense, much like a Colorado mountain resort community or ocean community. Much of our major industry today is catering to and working in conjunction with or in planning for this population that in some ways is our industry, but is not necessarily part of our committed residence group.
And it is hard for that person who knows that he or she's going to be moving out within a few years to bring some sort of a sense of commitment, isn't there? I mean, I once lived in a ski resort, and people came and went like that, and the attitude was, well, you know, why should we dig in too deep here?
And that's the challenge. You know, I mean, East Lawrence, for example, is 30% owner-occupied. And you see East Lawrence with a very different set of agendas in what they want for development compared to a prosperous Albemarle neighborhood, which, you know, there are more things that tend to divide those people than bring them together. And that can be a challenge.
In which of the two?
Well, I would say if you feel as though you're in a neighborhood that's 30% owner-occupied versus an Albemarle, which is probably 90% owner-occupied, those are different interests, you know, and they're different views of the world.
Oh, you're saying divide the Albemarle from the, let's say,
the East Lawrence, right? And so
Lawrence,
that's and you get more of what I call less informal consensus building and more stereotyped formal confrontation between developers and preservationists. And that's clearly one of the things that concerns me as a historian, because history is to some degree being held hostage in this battle between neighborhoods and developers.
Well, Steve, explain that. Now, how do you save history, by the way? I mean, how do you hold on to what is true, what really has happened?
Well, first of all, I think for each one of you that may be viewing this, take yourself in your history seriously. You may say you've never done anything notable or worthwhile, but your story is perhaps the greatest legacy that one can give to one's descendants. We think about leaving things, and what is our legacy going to be? Well, our memories, our views, our perspectives, our humorous incidents, our stories, our tragedies are who we are. And so if one will put them down on paper, turn on a tape recorder, or in this day and age, video cameras, and leave that legacy, you will give, you know, hopefully as people listen to me, they see my hands move, they hear me talk, they get my inflections, a sense of my personality is conveyed. And anytime we leave an audio tape or write down our thoughts or leave a video record, people 50 years from now, 75 years from now, will have an incredible ability, hopefully, to know us. And we don't tend to leave those traces and tracks.
We live for now, is that it?
Well, and we think we got to leave possessions.
Yeah.
I mean, the greatest, we leave, you know, $100,000 life insurance, which is, you know, on the face of it attractive, but that's going to pass.
Right.
If we leave our culture, if we leave our stories, if we leave our perspectives for our descendants, they will know us in a way that money can't buy. They will know what was important to us.
Well, think of if George Washington could walk into this generation,
right,
how floored he would be by everything, you know. But how would he look at the people? How would he see the changes in the people in the 200 and some years?
He would probably be amazed at how incredibly democratic we are, and I mean a small d here. Many people voting, many people participating, and in the sense of enfranchisement is enlarged.
The local thing.
Right. I mean, and then I think this whole idea of the media, the whole sense of not being totally defined by your locality anymore. I mean, America was an incredibly large experiment when it was 13 colonies. Now it's an incredible, by George Washington standards.
You could say, Mr. President, did you know that your nation has put a man on the moon? And he would say, sure. I mean,
right.
Or words to that effect.
But people who are watching this tonight have lived through 70 years, in some cases 80 years of incredible changes, and your experiences, the things that happened to you. I had one man I interviewed, and I said to him, you know, the Depression must have been a big deal to you. And he said he grew up in rural Atchison County around Nortonville, and he said, I was poor before the Depression, I was poor during the Depression, and I was poor after the Depression. So this depression that you historians talk about is no big deal by me. Well, that's what each one of us can tell people about. The lenses, the ways we see the world. Mm-hmm. So your stories, your memories, you may think they're not important, and nobody wants to listen to you now, but if you will have faith, That's the greatest gift you can give to those that will follow you, is your sense of the world, communicated written, orally through audio tapes, or visually through audio-visual tapes.
I'm well acquainted with a woman who is now a little more than 101 years old. And what you say is absolutely true, because to sit down and talk with this person who's clear of mind,
Right.
and let her tell you about riding in the Conestoga wagons. You know, I mean, things that you just, the first time she saw a light bulb,
Right.
the first time she talked on a telephone. All of those things are a part of her life that, you're right, need to be recorded, need to be taped or something for posterity. You say we need to be doing the same thing.
Right, and don't think you've got to have somebody like me coming to do it. If you can, talk with a friend, talk with a family member, and just have a conversation. Make it as easy and as low-key and as informal as possible, but leave a permanent record. And if nobody's there to talk to, then do it yourself, because someday it's the greatest gift you could give to those that come.
We've got 4 years until we, well, really 5 years into the next
Right.
century. Where are we going from here? We've got 2 minutes. Tell me where we're going.
Well, Lawrence is rapidly becoming part of a Johnson County, Shawnee County center. And we are, in a sense, in eastern Kansas, doing much like what we see along the Pacific coast between Santa Barbara and San Diego, and between, say, Boston, Massachusetts, and Baltimore, Maryland.
So
we're
they call it
becoming our own.
megalopolis?
Well, yeah, and we're kind of fusing together, and that reflects in people work in Topeka and Kansas City and live in Lawrence, and vice versa. And that means that there's a great concern that we may become just a bedroom community and lose our own sense of distinctiveness. Well, hopefully that's where the museum comes in. We will be the center that will encourage the preservation in the stimulation of our own culture, so that even though we can be in touch with every place else, we still have a good sense of this place.
I think we'll do okay as long as we don't think we have to change the name to something like Can's Law Pop or Can's Law Top.
Please, no.
Let's don't
right,
do that.
let's not do that.
Hey, great series. Thank you.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
it, my friend.
Thanks to everybody who's made it possible.
This has been great, a great series. Thank you for joining us, and of course, we'll be back next week with another edition of As Time Goes By. Thanks, Steve.